Thank you very much, Mike. Thank you also to Giles for the lead-in. It's perfect. It's almost as if we coordinated. So, very well done. I'm super thrilled to be able to address you today because of the importance of the work of the CBA, and not least in light of Mike's announcement, actually, that he's off, the amount of work that he's done and the contribution he's done to British archaeology. So it gives me a little platform just to say thank you to Mike myself, very selfishly, but I think he's done amazing deeds, and I've been able to have this platform to talk to you. And he talks about, in his piece, he talked about some of the many things that the CBA has been responsible for and what they want to look at. One of those things is increasing access to heritage. What I'm going to do to you today is talk to you about one particular group. You're not going to be surprised to hear that it's about service personnel, wounded, injured and sick, a demographic that quite often we don't reach in heritage in the sector as a whole. A lot of the individuals that we've worked with on this project of Operation Nightingale over the years have perhaps not considered that heritage and archaeology is for them. And I would argue that we've hopefully shown that it is for them. Because there's a job for everyone in archaeology, be it working in the cookhouse or cleaning the finds or doing the surveying or doing the digging or shoveling dirt, whatever, we can find a job for them. And an interesting job and an engaging job, and we'll talk to that throughout. And also another thing that Mike says, that throughout this work, that he's realised that 20th century has left a legacy. And you think of the Home Front project that was so successful. That's a good thing, because I'm going to talk to you about 3 projects, 2 of which are based in the 20th century in archaeology. So I'm glad we can all agree that it is archaeology now. I'm going to start with my favourite book. You ever get the chance to buy it? It's a nice quick read. I'm not on a commission, unlike the Wessex Archaeology thing. This is a J.L. Carr, A Month in the Country. Wonderful, wonderful piece of work. And in that book, it's based at the end of the First World War, where you have 2 individuals who have been very badly damaged by that conflict. The way that they get through it is a wonderful interpersonal relationships that they build, and the way they get through it is through their approaches to cultural heritage. One of them is looking at a medieval wall painting in a church, a doom scene, and the other one is looking at an Anglo Saxon cemetery based in the village of Osgood in Lincolnshire. And there's also a film you can find online with a very young Colin Firth and Kenneth Branagh image on the left there. It's a charming film, but they look at cultural heritage, archaeology, historic buildings as a way to forget that horror of that conflict. And the individuals we've been working with over, well, pretty much a decade now, we started in 2011, have also faced those things for real. Going from top left clockwise, that's a scene of a British armoured column facing the Falaise Gap in Normandy. Then top right, a scene of Afghanistan. Bottom right, that's the road to Basra in Iraq from the first Gulf War. And then bottom left, that's HMS Sheffield. That's the first of the British ships hit in the Falklands War. And we have had veterans from 3 of those conflicts, Afghanistan, Iraq and the Falklands War, on our project. But the one to the top left is where my introduction to the effects of conflict on the human mind really began. And that's because my father was a veteran of the Second World War. He was a British tank commander in the 5th Dragoons. And in the last week of his life, and he was one of those classic British officers that never talked about the war, apart from funny stories involving hitting chateaus accidentally with his tank, really. I shouldn't say that in heritage. Anyway, only ever had funny stories. Apart from the last week in his life, when his body was clearly shutting down, and his mind was releasing these things, and he would wake up each morning thinking he was in Normandy and he's on the radio to his friends in other tanks when they're under attack. So the body is letting go, and he locked that away for over half a century. So dealing with that is something I don't think you ever fully do, and it's finding ways to deal with mental health is so, so important. I think you can deal with physical wounds. The mental health ones, we've got to find a way of doing these things. Social prescription is a word that you will hear in the future, along with well-being. Well-being is going to be critical for heritage and archaeology in the future, I think we'll all agree. And dealing with those sorts of things, very important. So that was my introduction, knowing that my father had these issues that he'd never really expressed. And that's where we came to this, Nightingale, Operation Nightingale, named after the staff of Epicurus with the serpent going around what should be a staff, but we put it around a trowel. Designed by Professor Simon James of Leicester University, this one, and now trademarked to the Secretary of State for Defence. I bet they don't know, but it is their ownership. Named after the very famous medic in the Crimean War, Florence Nightingale. So we've set this thing up. It's a Ministry of Defence project with 1 billion and one partners that we'll come to. And a lot of our archaeological techniques do come from the military, and there are a lot of very famous individuals that have a military heritage or have been affected by war. I'm not going to do the testing thing because I've written it up for you. O.G.S. Crawford, we'll come across a few of these individuals throughout the evening. O.G.S. Crawford, the pioneer of British archaeological air photography. He was using his techniques as a member of the Royal Flying Corps in the First World War, and then applied them to archaeology afterwards. Lieutenant General Pitt Rivers, one of the pioneers of wonderful archaeological stratigraphic recording. If you look at his archives, they're immaculate, but he's a Lieutenant General, so a military element to it. Now, difficult to see, but you can see Stonehenge about to be re-erected. And a chap here with a very nice handlebar moustache is Colonel Hawley, excavated at Stonehenge, and on other places on the UK mainland, and we'll see his works later on. I'm not going to explain even where this is, fairly obvious. 3 figures here, very famous. You've got Gertrude Bell, one of the most extraordinary characters in British history. Get a chance to read what she did, incredible. Winston Churchill, sat on a camel. What could possibly go wrong? And then T. Lawrence, better known as Lawrence of Arabia, who studied Crusader castles at Jesus College, Cambridge, Jesus College, Oxford, sorry. Yeah, I know, it's from Oxford, terrible, anyway. So he applied his knowledge in a First World War basis. So lots of our forebears have got a military background. Of course, we're here to commemorate Beatrice to Cardi, and Mark's already said some very warm and pertinent words about Beatrice, and she also was affected by war. You may or may not know that she had a fiancé that was killed in the Second World War. But she also had recollections of the First World War. Now I'm going to read out what she said about the First World War. We think about archaeology and looking at artefacts and how we experience the past. Is it through smell, of taste, of touch? Well, her memories of the Great War is a really quite an interesting one. And she wrote, "I've only one recollection of World War I, but that's an unusual one. I must have been no more than 2.5 or 3 at the time when Zeppelins were over London and the family moved down to its coal cellar. I can remember my mother clad in an evening dress of black velvet, trimmed with sable, clutching me, and we stood until a chair was brought, and I wondered what on earth she was doing in that sort of dress and surrounded by coal. I think it was a dress that I remember on its tactile interest, and certainly it's an element in my character that survived because I've always had an interest in clothes and their feeling." So, based at the Museum of London, that talk, and that's an interesting thing, that we have our recollections, our memories. I mean, smell's a really powerful one I can think of, but yes, that tactile thing takes her back to a feeling of war. And what are those triggers that bring the mind back to warfare? I mentioned O.G.S. Crawford earlier. Obviously, to Cardi, her links with archaeology became, she did so many things, but one of those jobs was being secretary to this chap on the right, Mortimer Wheeler. Mortimer Wheeler was an artillery officer in the Great War, became a brigadier in the Second World War, and in a conversation which O.G.S. Crawford had, he was illustrating the importance of looking at air photography and transcribing them correctly, because he'd found this thing where his person had transcribed a photograph of a thing called the Butte de Valencourt, and he'd got the hashes the wrong way around, so it looked like a big crater. And he said, "Does anyone here actually know what the mistake with that is? Because it shouldn't be a crater." At which point Wheeler said, "Well, I'm pretty well aware what the Butte de Valencourt is because I was there in the First World War." Now, the Butte de Valencourt is a First World War burial mound. It's the furthest that the British reached in 1916 on those first days of the Battle of the Somme. It was then fought over in 1918. And in 1918, Wheeler captures it, or captures some field guns by there, and here is the attestation for his Gallantry Award. It says, for conspicuous gallantry and initiative, while making a reconnaissance, he saw 2 enemy field guns limbered up without horses within 300 yards of the outpost line. He returned for 2 6-horse teams and under heavy fire, in full view of the enemy, successfully brought back both guns to his battery position and then turned them on the enemy. A wonderful finishing of very understated British language. He did fine work. As a result, he is awarded this, the Military Cross. So Wheeler knows this fortified position and is able to say to Crawford, well, I'm pretty well aware of it because I won a military cross there. But for him, although successful as a military officer, clearly, it was still an affecting thing. And here you can see his letter to Tess, his first wife. I cannot attempt to describe the conditions under which we're fighting. Anything I could write about them would seem exaggeration, but would in reality be miles below the truth. The whole battlefield for miles is a congested mass of sodden, rain-filled shell holes which are being added to every moment. The mud is not so much mud as fathomless sticky morass. If it were not for the cement pillboxes left by the Boche, not a thing could live many hours. So clearly, even for somebody who's getting these awards and is a successful soldier and appreciates topography, it's still got a horror in his mind. Here's the book. Here's the illustration on the left from the Imperial War Museum in London, and on the right in the Australian War Memorial. It's a burial mound which has been used, because it's given fantastic cover anyway, used by the Germans as a fortification. Not something we tend to encourage troops to do today on the training areas, because there is this thing called heritage at risk, which that would firmly be included upon. So this is something that they encounter in the First World War, and it's one of these visage on the First World War battlefields that is very, very popular and much visited. So much so that the very famous British war artist Sir William Orpen visits it and produces this rather shocking image, the stark image of a chalk mound, all that's left of the burial mound, some time after the first conflict, as you can see the grass has grown up. And this is what Orpen encounters and uses to illustrate that landscape of conflict. And Orpen didn't stop there. He was one of those artists that was given a lot of access and was able to record the full horror of that conflict, using colours that were really very vivid. On your left there, you can see an image of 2 dead Germans in one of their trenches, painted by Orpen, and on the right, the new monsters that appear in the Great War, the tanks. So the tanks there, an invention in 1916, the first years of the Battle of Courcelette, but of course, they become archaeology themselves. But more of that later on. Now the CBA is a 75-year-old organisation. I think, Mike, you said March. Yeah. March. So March 75 years ago, 1944. Where were we then? Well, we were just pre-D-Day. And as such, we were an island that was full of immigrants at that point from all over the world, many of whom came from America. Can't tell you how happy I am to be able to show this slide. Brilliant. My guys on my team, these men and women who've been in the armed forces, a lot of them like military heritage because that's their tribal narrative. The military, I view, has a bit of anthropology. They have their own language, customs, sorry Giles, traditions, all the sorts of things you'd normally expect of doing anthropology. And knowing this and being part of this in a grouping, if you are part of the military, you appreciate military archaeology. So that's what we've used a lot of our archaeological focus for, is to look at sites of conflict for which these individuals will have an understanding or some sort of interpretation anyway. So very cynically, Digging Band of Brothers. This is a project that we ran last year. No, it was this year, because they will merge into one. This year, in the spring, in a village called Oldbourne in Wiltshire. Because this is where the Easy Company of the 101st Airborne 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment were based in the field in Wiltshire in late 43 into 1944. This was their home prior to their dropping in on the first hours of the D-Day landings in June 1944. The image here you can see is of the sergeants of Easy Company. This is a chap called Carwood Lipton, and this is their hut camp on the sports pitches at Oldbourne. And we wanted to see if there was anything left of this site. And what we do with all of our projects with these things is to give that gamut of opportunity to the participants to be able to see whether they want to do the desktop work, to look at their photographs, take part in the geophysics, do the metal detecting from the spoil heap point of view, the digging, or just simply being part of a team again, sit around a fire, tell racy stories and have a few beers. This is an air photograph of the camp in the 1940s. You can see all these buildings here, quite well served. It's now been levelled so it can provide AFC Aldbourne for someone to play with. And we were told that there's going to be nothing left. You can see traces of the building still around, not many. This is there's a local mechanic uses this Nissen hut as part of his mechanical storeroom, so that's been shifted off the site, moved elsewhere. But it does give the potential for geophysical survey. A chap called Dave Sabin of Archaeological Surveys did this fieldwork for us. This is a magnetometry survey, and although you've got the classic bar magnet effect of later pipes going in, and these are the floodlights of the football pitch, no longer there, but they've left a legacy, you can still see bits and pieces under this ground, little traces of what might be there. So it was certainly enough for us to put out some exploratory trenches and set the army to work. Here you've got two infantrymen digging a hole on a football pitch. Normally, if you ask infantry to dig holes, they tend to moan about it because it's a chore. These two actually found it quite a pleasure. So they're working, taking the turf off the first day on our site at Aldbourne. We try to get as much of a community together, so we've partnered up some logistics people with Royal Engineers, who does a lot of our mapping for us. That's one of the skill sets that the Royal Engineers possess. And I've included this image because it's me doing some work. Very, very rare entity. It's a collector's item, so that's me operating the barrows for two of our military archaeologists as they dig deeper and deeper onto this hut site. Well, in fact, although we were told that nothing of this site survived because it's all been levelled, there were a lot of things still there. All these little post pads, you can see these white concrete pads coming on here and here, are the footings of that hut used by Easy Company, used by those groups, the Band of Brothers. And we were able to watch the film, I'll come to that a bit later on. But you can get the extent of the hut. It's got the remnants of the tar paper, which provided the waterproof coursing. And from that we're able to put the shape of the hut together based on the photograph of Carwood Lipton. So just below the surface of the spoil heap from the levelled playing field, we're able to build up a picture of that hut. And the pads survive pretty well. They're well preserved, they're not going to be destroyed. The village is able now to put together a management plan on how to look after this, and they still get visitors from America every year wanting to see where Easy Company, this famous unit, were based. So they're able now to go and see where this hut is. It's all been recovered, but nonetheless, it's something that they can take them and say, this is exactly the view that these guys faced. One thing I've learned working with the military is you've got to find things. A bored soldier is a very, very, very dangerous entity. And so we wanted to find things. Now we thought we weren't going to find a huge amount of stuff because it had been cleared, there had been some metal detecting there. How wrong was I? Because we're finding all these astonishing artefacts, beautifully illustrated by our professional photographer Harvey Mills, and they ranged from bits of metal used by the squatters that used the huts after the war, before these people were given council housing locally. We were finding, it's a much smaller scale, those are crisp packets. Crisp packets, some of them are pre-decimalisation crisp packets, which is a brilliant eco message to the school that came out and visited us. So Greta could have come and seen us and would have been quite happy because we've got an ecological message as well. We found a lot of marbles as well and toy cars where that humanity component was dealt with, where the village reclaimed those fields and used them to live. But of course we're looking for evidence of the paratroopers that were there. That's the key story that we wanted to deliver. Well, I think this is probably the most sensational find we had. If we could have scripted this, I'm pretty sure it was there, it wasn't planted by one of the team, because this is the reserve parachute pull from an American parachute, still got a bit of red paint on. You only ever use that if your main shooters fail to deploy. This is your last chance of surviving, and we're all coming up with theories as to why it's there. Is it a souvenir? Was it taken back to a sweetheart? Was this thing because they'd actually used it and they wanted to have this as a memento of their first drop into Normandy and they'd survived? Well, who knows really. But nonetheless, it's an American artefact related to Easy Company, and if you're looking for the Band of Brothers, it doesn't get better than that. although we did find some parachute too. So in a really small area, we found a parachute pool, we found bits of parachute, we found ammunition. These are what are called Garand clips. The American rifle has these, they are called clips, not charges, I've been told. Holds the ammunition, goes down into the rifles. Those are specifically American. We're finding all these little links to those guys that lived there 75 years ago, at the foundation of the CBA's time anyway. We also found bits of hearts and minds. We found a Brill cream bottle. We found lots of bits of foodstuffs. A Brill cream bottle, and I like to think of the soldiers using this on a night out to go and meet some of the young ladies in Oldbourne. We know that they were pretty successful at that because they wore out the dance floor of the dance hall, and they had to pay for a new one at the end of the war. So maybe Hearts and Minds went pretty well. We also found some stockings in the hut as well, so maybe it went a bit too far, who knows. And other things, a Pepsi Cola bottle, wartime period, so they're bringing over their foodstuffs, rations, really, really important for the military mindset. Also illustrated by these spam keys. These guys suffered privation before they went to Normandy, clearly, so they're eating tins of spam. And I said to you before that a bored soldier is a very, very dangerous thing. And we can illustrate that because we found a threepenny bit with a bullet hole and a bullet through it. Now, in my mind, it wouldn't be the most obvious thing to do instead of reading a book, maybe, to put a coin on the end of your gun and fire it just to see what happened. But that's certainly what one of the Americans had done there. Now, digging for Britain is normally given treasures like the Scremby Cup or the some of those wonderful chariot pieces from East Yorkshire. Not everyone's thrilled to be given a load of old rust and a manky old parachute, but you will be able to see what we did with this on the 11th of December, where the Band of Brothers Dig does make Alice's programme. And further than that, we get little vignettes about the human lives, because they leave their legacies. We found foxholes where they practiced before going to Normandy, or sometimes maybe going out to the Ardennes campaigns. Actually, the Bridge Too Far, that was their last campaign, when they parachuted into the Netherlands. Well, they've left their little legacies on trees. You get carvings on the beech trees nearby, and this one, CL, SC, USA. Now, it's tempting to think, given the name of the sergeant in front of our hut, Carwood Lipton, CL, who was from South Carolina, SC, USA, it's tempting to think that he put his name there before going over to fight in Normandy. It may be, it may not be, but there's certainly some research that can be done with this sort of thing, and that's going into the archives afterwards and doing a non-excavation piece of research that anyone can do. A critical thing as well is not just doing that 2-week on-site thing or 1-week on-site thing, is providing all the other elements to it to engage and to interest and to inspire them to go off and do other bits of archaeology or heritage, or just get involved, or just be part of a community again. And we're able to blag all sorts of things. We managed to persuade a Dakota with the D-Day stripes to fly over site as we were doing it. This is the sort of aircraft that those American paratroopers on D-Day jumped out of, and that's a really inspiring thing for these guys to be able to see this holistic approach to dealing with heritage. There's a local museum, Littlecote House, for those that have been to it, wonderful Roman mosaic in the garden, dug by Bryn Walters. But if you go into the house as well, this wonderful 17th century manor house, there is a little museum to the airborne, the 101st Airborne, the Screaming Eagles, because they commandeered it in the Second World War. This is headquarters of the American company, and it must have been extraordinary for those American officers to be in this stately home. What an experience. In fact, the other ranks, when they ended up in the village of Oldbourne, some of them they'd transported at night down from Liverpool. They were put into these huts and sometimes into stable blocks. Some of them woke up in the morning. One of them said, "We thought we'd come out and landed up on a Hollywood film set." This quintessential English village with a village green and a beautiful church and these half-timbered and thatched buildings. Quite idyllic. And you think that's that pre-maelstrom thing for them. Their last couple of months of life for many of these people, this little English village before they're parachuted into the hell that was Normandy. And a lot of our guys like to sit round fires in the evenings, just have a beer, tell their talks, talk about their days digging, their discoveries, mixtures of some of our civilian supporters in with the military here, and just decompress, to talk about their stories in an environment that's nourishing and cathartic, I think. Or share a beer down the pub. You can also see the very limited edition Dig t-shirt here. It's the Ace of Spades. This is the logo of Easy Company. That will be featuring in the National Trust's exhibition of Dig fashion. It's happening in Sutton Hoo in the new year. I dread to think. I'm hoping that Phil's hat is there, and maybe a stripy jumper or two. We shall see. But there will be a t-shirt there. We were also visited by reenactors. It's a popular thing, so these guys reenact the American Airborne, and they're able to come along and provide some sort of texturing and colouring. Very good when we've got school groups. And as I said, the Americans wore out the dance floor of the local dance hall. Well, we had an evening there watching this TV series, Band of Brothers, with the cast, or one of the cast anyway. This is the guy that plays Private First Class Pankala, who is, we watched him being killed with him. Quite a strange experience. Anyway, having the actors of that TV series, it's all part of that, providing as many opportunities from a cultural heritage perspective to an audience that is otherwise maybe not going to see it so much. Moving on to the second of our three sites that I was going to touch upon. This is something that we've been visiting for a number of years now. It keeps going on. I keep trying to stop it and we keep going back. This is Barrow Clump. This is the Neolithic land surface with a Beaker Mound, with a Bronze Age mound, the Saxon cemetery, and then later military additions to it. Giles mentioned the publication is just out. You can see how we bring some military infrastructure to it. And we've been working here for a while. I'm sure one of you all know that one of the great sins in archaeology is sitting on the section. Just don't do it. Just don't do it. Because you get shouted at by your supervisor or your director. I'm sure you in the Young Archaeology Club, I'm sure you've either done some shouting or have been shouted at for this. It's a really good learning process. Never sit on the section. I went to shout at someone for sitting on the section and realised that they weren't actually there anymore. Now he is sitting on the section technically, but he's just removed his legs so that he can go and dig the rest of the cemetery. And I find that really awe-inspiring that somebody just finds a solution. And I do enjoy working with the military because they are people that find solutions. They find problems as well, but they usually find solutions to them. So this guy's just taken his legs off because he's more comfortable digging with it. It's also a really good thing for me to say if there's a student moaning about a bit of inclement weather, well, you know what, your problems are minor. So anyway, he's gone on and done this. We found, I think Phil's going to shout at me for everything I get wrong here. I think it's about 110 graves, which is where we think the Saxon settlement of Ablington is. And we excavated these in 2012, 13 and 14 because we knew there were going to be some good deposits. In 2003, a chap called Dr. Jonathan Last of Historic England was commissioned by his group to look at the nature of damage caused to ancient monuments by burrowing animals. And one of the two sites he looked at was Barrow Clump. It had been excavated by William Hawley, the chap I mentioned early on. So we thought it's been fairly well, how do we put this, examined beforehand, so there's perhaps not much archaeology left, but we'll be able to see the damage that the burrowing animals do. You can see it's pretty well truncated, a bit of a Swiss cheese effect. So Historic England went there to record this, and in so doing, they found a previously unknown Anglo Saxon cemetery, but that's not what they were there to do. They were there to record badger scrapes. How frustrating when you are finding on your very first trench a great square-headed brooch and a horse bit and all these wonderful trappings of the panoply of 6th century artefacts. No, you're not to do that. You're looking at recording badger hull. So poor old Jonathan and his team did that for 2 years, 2003 and 2004, and then left. The site was on heritage at risk. I was losing the battle very quickly because badgers, I'm sure you're aware, are very, very good at digging and very poor at recording and very tenacious. So all my protection measures were failing. The final score being, when I was told that there was an Anglo Saxon spear on my burial mound, do I want to go and deal with it? At which point we got a budget together, and with Wessex Archaeology we excavated it, preservation by record, and it worked beautifully for the soldiers. I mean, look, you can't have that sort of thing lying on the surface of your monument. It's a 6th century great square-headed brooch with all this wonderful Saxon design being repaired in antiquity. We therefore returned for three seasons initially, 2012, 13 and 14, with the express job remit of recovering the Anglo-Saxon cemetery that was vulnerable. And we did this with a lot of infantrymen. These are guys from the Rifles, with Wessex Archaeology here, and all sorts of other people put together as an eclectic team to see what we could retrieve. Well, we started off on the ditch of the burial mound. Here's Mike Heaton, showing various military, and I like to show this one because it just shows the only person working is the archaeologist, and the three military are just watching. But they gained a huge respect, I think, for their prehistoric predecessors, because digging in chalk is not much fun, solid chalk. They nowadays try to get the Royal Engineers to do it for them with the JCB or big bit of digger. Instead, they just used Mike on this one. I'm just going to now quickly go through a couple of case studies about what it's meant for people. The chap on the right is an ex-tank soldier. When we lifted the tank track, it had the bodies of 2 Germans underneath it. For him, that was him transported straight back to Iraq, where his friends in the tank were killed. And he'd never been able to say goodbye to them. So he had quite a bad trigger. Luckily, we had Help for Heroes, our mental health operative with us, who were able to bring him back to the here and now, getting away from Iraq back to France 2018. And as a result of this, he was able to actually work physically on digging these remains up and talk to them as if it was his tank crew, and say his goodbyes to them, and to assure these Germans that they were going to get a proper grave and a proper burial, and they were being looked after by kindred spirits. An astonishing thing to witness for me, and it was also a very good lesson for me to have all those people on site to be able to deal with the process. We did have, but it was just a reminder that you do need it. So Pete finished that work and still keeps in touch, still digs with us. Kenny, rifleman. Rifleman Rowan Kendrick, 5th Battalion of the Rifles, had a bad tour of Afghanistan, medically discharged as a result. He was working on this male burial at Barrow Clump, and I think it's the first burial he worked on actually. He finds this thing, probably the best preserved drinking bucket, 6th century in date, made of stems of yew, with these bands of bronze with repoussé decoration on. Absolutely incredible. So he's peaked too early. He'll never find anything ever anywhere near as good as that. And I said to him after about 3 or 4 days of this, "Are you not getting bored digging this grave, Kenny?" He said, "Nope, because I'm concentrating so hard not to cock up that I'm sleeping at night." So for him, archaeology provided sleep, and maybe if I keep talking, that will do the same. But that's an element of solace that we may not appreciate in archaeology. I'm sure you all concentrate really hard when you're doing the field work, but for some people that is actually life-saving. Quite a powerful thought. So Kenny finds this thing. He said to me, "I'm now going to be able to take my family to Devizes, where it's now on display in the museum, and say I've given something back to the country." This is a guy who's fought for his country, but he views cultural heritage as that important that he's left a legacy as he sees it. If you go to the British Museum, there's this image opposite the Sutton Hoo helmet. Man buried with a small bucket and a spear from the Anglo Saxon cemetery at Barrow Clump, Wiltshire. Copyright Wessex Archaeology. Burial excavated by Rowan Kendrick, 5 Rifles. So he's got his name next to the Sutton Hoo helmet, and that's something I am never ever going to get. And it makes me think of this. Lance being able to go into the British Museum, pointing out the astle and saying, "I found that. What a thing." Kenny is now still in archaeology, works for a commercial firm in the north of England. He's been working as a commercial archaeologist, started with Wessex, works in commercial archaeology. He's done it since 2012. So 7 years an archaeologist, having been infantry. Steve, I managed to find the 2 slides of him that exist of him smiling. And his kids will say the same. They brought him a t-shirt with Grumpy at the 7 Dwarfs on it. Anyway, so here he is, his window. He's doing the scene on the left for the time team, working the bellows to make an Anglo Saxon object. He was here because he was blown up in Afghanistan by a mortar fired by the Taliban. His career was finished with the Rifles. He'd always wanted to do archaeology, and that was his career finished, basically. And for him, that gave suicidal thoughts. I'm not breaking any confidences. He's been on television on the Time team saying as much. About 2 minutes after doing that photograph, that also blew up. So that could have gone one of two ways. He did get up smiling, however, and saying, "Oh, I can't believe how difficult this is." So for Winnow, we set the whole Nightingale project up for Steve, and for him it was really quite something. The thing that stopped him committing suicide, he said, was watching Time Team. And I think we forget how important Time Team really was to many, many people. Not necessarily professionals too, but outside it. I think we really do need your Digging for Britons, your Time Teams, because if we don't tell a story as archaeology, what are we doing? So there he is, working there. For 3 years, he was going on about wanting to find a sword. On a pretty much daily basis, I want a sword, I want a sword. Poor old Phil was having to tell him, they're quite rare, you know, Steve, you don't often find these things. And there's this thing in the military called banter. It could also be termed abuse, but banter is one of these things where they'll sit there and ridicule one another, very, very funny at times. And Steve had been working on poor old Phil for 3 years about wanting to find a sword, and as a result of which Phil has learnt banter. Because on the last week, pretty much the last grave, Steve finds this long bit of metal and he says, "I think I found a sword." Calls Phil over and Phil says, "Yeah, that's a bit of a tractor." And Steve was crestfallen until Phil had to admit, yes, it was a sword. It was a sword. So here's Steve with his 85 centimetre long platinum welded sword with a horn handle, bronze fittings, really, really very lovely. The chap who left his legs on site, Tyler, he's unstoppable. This man is just, he's morale on a stick, he really is. He is the British para sledge hockey captain at the moment. He was named player of the match last week against Germany. He's also canoed down the Yukon, he's parachuted, and here he is learning how to record a section. And he works out, record a burial, he works out how he can do it himself. So he is recording this particular burial by lowering himself in, finding grid squares. He is just an astonishing individual. Way more active than he ever was in the army, by all accounts as well. Rob, here, we put him in this suit because Rob is the one that will always have the practical jokes played upon him. We made him wear the forensic suit for no apparent reason. Weirdly, he quite enjoyed it. So he's got his suit on. He's working on a place called Rat Island down in Gosport, recovering the burials of some prisoners or prisoners of war from the 18th and 19th century. He's a lad with, I think, very few qualifications to his name. He's joined our programme and he now has a 2-2 degree in archaeology from the University of Winchester and works for Mola. Wonderful. This individual, we always have photographs of him with skeletons because his bald head is perfect. It's just a wonderful juxtaposition. This is Matt. Matt only joined our programme to shut his friend up. His friend joined us, these are both in the Royal Signals, joined us to do some archaeology and had such a good time. He'd go back and talk to Matt about, "Oh, I've had a brilliant day, I'm doing archaeology." And Matt said, "I'm fed up with you talking about this, I'm going to go along for a day just to shut you up." And we've not got rid of him. 7 years on, Matt is here working on a female burial at Barrow Clump. There were loads of really quite nice beads in this particular grave. He was next to a Royal Marine who was also working on a burial with lots of beads. The two of them were arguing who had the prettier jewellery. And I said, if you'd gone back to your barracks, gentlemen, 10 years in the past, what would they have thought of you? Anyway, Matt found this particular item in that very grave. He is holding it at the Wiltshire and Swindon Heritage Centre at Chippenham with the conservator, because this is a Visigothic brooch with bands of brass. Here's a image taken with a microscope of the textile remains on it. A beautiful illustration in the excavation volume of this particular brooch, alongside all the beads with it and a bone pin. I think I'm right in saying it's the only Visigoth brooch found in a grave in Britain. Only the second one, the one being Springfield, found at all in Britain. So another one who's found an amazing find. I'm getting quite jealous by this point. So you've got him with his Visigoth brooch, Kenny with his bucket. I'm going to ban them all so I can start finding some stuff soon. And we come to Dickie, I think is probably one of the most impressive individuals I think I've ever met. He's don't record this and ever tell him that. So he's an ex-member of 40 Commando Royal Marine. He was blown up several times, the last of which meant that he was having to leave the military. He came to Barrow Clump the first time with his daughter as part of a whole being together with family experience, another very important component, to get a feeling for doing something different. So did some archaeology, as a result of which he was so inspired that he went to Exeter University, did an archaeology degree, got a first, which is more than I have, got a master's degree in archaeology, and he's now set up a charity called Breaking Ground Heritage that brings veterans in to do archaeology, sorts out all their logistics, all their wellbeing needs, and really importantly, he assesses it. So he monitors the outcomes. So this is not just, we think anecdotally that it's doing good. He has got the empirical data set, which is very important. He's publishing it in Antiquity to show that archaeology is very, very beneficial from a well-being perspective. He's looking at it from the military point of view, but I'm sure you can extrapolate further. The work of YAC, we've talked about it today, and I think it's really important that we do inspire a young generation. The three individuals here today that all won, it's brilliant to see young people doing this. I've included James because he's here with his mum, who is a squadron leader in the RAF, and they're doing a project up in Lincolnshire with Carenza Lewis to look at family involvement. And I mentioned that with Dickie, having family around is a really important thing because people can deploy for months and months at a time, and I think we often forget that those people in conflict zones are suffering, but their families also need care and love as well, because what they're going through is different, but there is a correlation that we need to think about. And so James, working with Susie, I was delighted to see his nomination and being part of these three really inspiring young people that have been celebrated today as part of the YAC Awards. I think it's really important because we need young people to be coming through and infusing that next generation about the importance of heritage. I'm just going to close with this one tag. I was given a fines tag by some of the military, and this is, it mentions me, but I don't want to seem vain. This has nothing to do with me. This is about the programme. It simply says, the project and the help given me have literally saved my life. And to see that as an archaeologist is an astonishing experience. If you ever asked as an undergraduate or in wider life, what is the point in archaeology? Well, archaeology is, I think, essential for all of us, our understanding of where we came from, our appreciation of where we're going in many ways. It ticks so many boxes on the well-being front, and an appreciation of heritage, I think, can make us better people. And the more we keep pushing that to the powers that hold the purse strings and also put our country back together again, the better, I think. So thanks to all of you. Big thanks to Mike and the CBA for all the work that you do. Wessex sponsored it. Thanks. I will say thanks to Wessex for a lot of work they do on the Nightingale programme, and thank you for listening.